The fog pressed against the cobblestones like a living thing. It rolled through the narrow lanes of Whitechapel, coiling around lampposts, muffling the clatter of hooves on stone. The gaslights burned dim, their halos swallowed by the grey. Somewhere in the distance a child's voice called out high and thin, then stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No footsteps, no answer. Only the fog, thickening. She had been there moments before, a girl of perhaps 9 years, her apron stained with coal dust, her feet bare despite the October cold. The woman who sold matches on the corner had seen her pass, had watched her small figure drift toward the alley between the tannery and the lodging house. The woman had turned away for no more than a breath, adjusting the shawl across her shoulders. When she looked back, the alley was empty, the fog hung undisturbed. The girl was gone. By morning, 3 more families would report the same. A son vanished between the bakery and his mother's door. A daughter who stepped out to fetch water and never returned. Each time the fog had been thick. Each time no one had heard a scream, a struggle, a cry for help. The children simply ceased to exist, as though the city itself had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. The police would come, their boots echoing through the streets, their lanterns casting long shadows against the brick. They would ask their questions. They would find nothing, and the fog would roll on, indifferent, eternal, as it had for 1,000 years before. The city held its breath. Something had begun. Chapter 1. The Fog and the Vanishing. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small and still. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour has found you, whether the clock reads midnight or the early grey of dawn, know that you are safe here. Let the day fall away. Let your breathing slow. We are going to drift backward in time together to a place where the streets were narrow and the gaslights burned low, where fog rolled through the city like a living thing, and where children vanished into darkness without a sound. This is a story from the shadowed corners of Victorian London, from the autumn of 1807, when something moved through the poorest districts and left behind only silence and grief. If you are new here, welcome. If you are returning, welcome back. Please take a moment to subscribe if you have not already. It helps this channel grow, helps these forgotten stories find their way to those who need them most. And if you are enjoying this journey into history's darker corridors, leave a comment below. Tell us where you are listening from, what time it is in your corner of the world. We are all here together, separated by 1.5 centuries from the events we are about to witness, but bound by the simple act of remembering. Now, let the present fade. Let us step into the fog. The autumn of 1807 came to London, with unusual heaviness. The fog that year arrived early, in the first weeks of October, and it did not lift. It settled over the Thames like a grey shroud, crept through the narrow courts and alleys of the East End, clung to the brick and stone of tenement walls. The poor called it a pea souper, thick enough to taste, thick enough to lose oneself in after only a few steps. The gaslights burned all day, their flames struggling against the murk, casting halos that reached no farther than a man's outstretched hand. The city became a place of shadows and echoes, where sound carried strangely, where distances became impossible to judge, where the familiar turned foreign. In Whitechapel, in Spitalfields, in Bethnal Green, the fog pressed close. These were districts where families lived 10 to a room, where children slept on floors of bare wood or stone, where the stench of tanneries and slaughterhouses mixed with the smoke of countless coal fires. The streets here had no aims that appeared on maps. The courts and passages twisted back upon themselves, leading to dead ends, to hidden yards, to places where even the police hesitated to enter after dark. It was a world unto itself, separate from the grand thoroughfares of Westminster and Mayfair, separate from the empire that the city claimed to rule. Here, life was measured in shillings and pence, in crusts of bread and hours of labour, in the simple act of surviving from one dawn to the next. The children of these districts moved through the fog like ghosts themselves. They ran errands for pennies, carried water from the public pumps, swept crossings, sold matches and flowers and whatever else might earn a coin. Many had no shoes. Many wore clothes so thin and ragged that they offered no protection against the October cold. They were small, these children, made smaller by hunger and the diseases that swept regularly through the crowded tenements. Rickets bent their bones. Consumption hollowed their cheeks. They moved quickly, accustomed to the streets, to the dangers that lurked in alleyways and courts. They knew which corners to avoid, which men to run from, which doors might open to offer a crust or a kind word. They were survivors, hardened by circumstances that would have broken children born into different worlds. On the evening of October the 7th, a girl named Mary Wickham left her family's lodging in a court off Dorset Street. She was 9 years old, small even for her age, with dark hair that hung in tangles past her shoulders. Her mother had sent her to fetch water from this pump 2 streets away. The family shared a single room on the 3rd floor of a building that housed 40 souls, and water had to be carried up the narrow stairs in buckets. Mary had made this journey 100 times before. She knew the way even in darkness, even in fog. She took the tin bucket from beside the door, pulled a thin shawl around her shoulders, and descended the stairs. The fog that evening was particularly dense. It swallowed the gaslights, turned the familiar streets into a maze of grey. Mary moved carefully, one hand trailing along the wall, the bucket clanging against her leg with each step. She could hear voices, muffled and distant, the sounds of the city carrying strangely through the murk. A dog barked, a door slammed. Somewhere a woman laughed, the sound sharp and sudden before fading into nothing. Mary reached the pump, worked the handle until water splashed into her bucket, then turned back the way she had come. She never arrived home. Her mother waited an hour, then 2, then descended the stairs herself to search. She found the bucket beside the pump, half full of water, abandoned. She called Mary's name into the fog, walked the streets until her voice grew hoarse, knocked on doors and asked if anyone had seen a small girl with dark hair and a grey shawl. No one had. The fog had swallowed everything. By morning, Mary's mother had reported her missing to the police station on Commercial Street. The sergeant who took the report wrote down the details in a ledger already thick with similar entries. Children went missing in the East End with depressing regularity. They fell into the river, or were taken by fever, or simply ran away to seek better fortunes elsewhere. Most were never found. The sergeant promised to make inquiries. He did not sound hopeful. The next night another child vanished. A boy named Thomas Byrne, 11 years old, who worked at a tannery on Brick Lane. He left the tannery at dusk, his hands stained dark with the chemicals used to cure leather, his clothes reeking of the trade. He lived only 3 streets away with his widowed father and 2 younger sisters. The walk should have taken him 10 minutes. He never arrived. His father, a man already bent by grief and labour, searched through the night, checking every alley, every court, every doorway where a boy might have stopped to rest. He found nothing. Thomas had simply ceased to exist between one street and the next. 2 nights later, 3 more children disappeared. A girl of 7 who'd been sent to buy bread. Twin brothers, 8 years old, who vanished together while playing in the court behind their building. Then 2 more, then 4. By the end of October, 12 children had gone missing from the streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. 12 children who had simply walked into the fog and never emerged. The police began to take notice. Constables were assigned to patrol the streets in greater numbers. Families were questioned. The missing children had nothing in common except their poverty and their proximity to the river. They ranged in age from 6 to 13, boys and girls both. Some had been alone when the they'd vanished. Others had been within sight of witnesses who had turned away for only a moment before the child was gone. The witnesses, when pressed, could offer nothing useful. The fog had been thick. They had heard nothing, no cries, no sounds of struggle, no running footsteps. One woman swore she had seen her son walking toward their door, had called out to him, had looked down to adjust her shawl, and when she looked up again the street was empty. Another man claimed he had watched his daughter step into an alley to avoid a puddle, had followed her only seconds later, and found the alley empty, the fog undisturbed, as though she had never been there at all. It was as if the children had been plucked from the earth by invisible hands, spirited away by something that moved in silence and left no trace. The newspapers began to report on the disappearances in early November. The Times ran a brief article on page 7, noting that police were investigating a series of missing children in the East End. The Illustrated Police News devoted more space to the matter, printing sketches of some of the missing children, alongside lurid speculation about their fate. The Morning Chronicle suggested the work of an organised gang, perhaps resurrection men who stole bodies for medical schools, though why they would take living children rather than corpses from graveyards remained unexplained. The Penny Dreadfuls, those cheap publications that was fed on sensation and horror, began publishing stories of a phantom stalker who walked through fog and stole children for purposes too dark to name. In the tenements and lodging houses of Whitechapel, fear took root. Parents who had once let their children run freely through the streets now kept them close. Schools reported increased attendance, not from any sudden devotion to education, but because parents feared letting their children out of sight. The streets at night grew quieter. Fewer children were seen after dusk. Those who had to venture out did so in groups, holding hands, calling out to one another every few steps to ensure no one had fallen behind. The fog continued to roll in from the river, thick and cold and impenetrable, and with it came the certainty that something was hunting in the darkness. The police stations were overwhelmed. Families arrived daily to report missing children, to beg for news, to demand that something be done. The Metropolitan Police assigned more men to the district, but what could they patrol against? The fog itself? The darkness between one gaslight and the next? The constables walked their beats, their whistles ready, their bullseye lanterns casting narrow beams into the grey. They questioned known criminals, raided opium dens and brothels, searched abandoned buildings and warehouse cellars. They found nothing. The children had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. No bodies were discovered. No ransom demands arrived. No witnesses came forward with useful information. There was only the fog and the silence and the growing list of names in the sergeant's ledger. By mid-November, the number of missing children had reached 23. The fog showed no sign of lifting, and in the narrow courts and alleys of Whitechapel, mothers held their children close and whispered prayers to a God who seemed very far away, while outside their windows the gaslights flickered and the fog pressed against the glass like something patient, something waiting, something that had all the time in the world. Chapter 2. The City of Shadows. London, in the year 1867, stood as the greatest city on earth. It was the heart of an empire that stretched across continents, the centre of industry and commerce, a metropolis of over 3 million souls packed into a sprawling landscape of brick and stone. The River Thames carved through its middle, carrying ships from every corner of the globe, their holds filled with tea from India, cotton from America, spices from the Orient, timber from Canada. The docks never slept. The factories never stopped. The great engine of progress churned day and night, producing wealth beyond measure for those who controlled the levers of power. But the city was not one place. It was many places, layered atop one another, separated not by distance but by circumstance and fortune. In the West End, in Belgravia and Mayfair, townhouses rose 4 and 5 stories high, their facades adorned with columns and cornices, their windows hung with velvet curtains. Inside, gaslights glowed in crystal chandeliers. Servants moved through halls floored with marble, carrying silver trays, stoking fires in every room. The wealthy lived insulated from the cold, from hunger, from the raw struggles of survival. They attended the opera and the theatre. They rode in private carriages through parks designed for leisure. They dined on 7 courses while discussing the affairs of Parliament and the progress of the Empire. Their children learned Latin and Greek, piano and watercolours, were raised by nursemaids and governesses and tutors who ensured they would never know hardship. In the East End, a different London existed. Here, in Whitechapel and Spitalfields, in Bethnal Green and Shoreditch, the city revealed its other face. The streets were narrow, often no wider than the span of a man's arms, paved with cobblestones that had cracked and shifted with age. The buildings leaned together as if exhausted, their walls stained black with soot, their windows broken or covered with rags and paper. Some structures dated back 2 centuries or more, timber-framed and sagging, their foundations sinking into the marshy ground. Others were newer, but built quickly and cheaply, thrown up to house the endless tide of workers drawn to the city by promises of employment. The population density in these districts was staggering. In some courts, over 1,000 people lived within a single acre. Families occupied single rooms, sharing beds, sharing space with strangers when the rent was split to make it affordable. The lodging houses of the East End were institutions unto themselves. For 4p a night, a man or woman could rent a bed in a communal room where dozens slept side by side, separated only by narrow gaps between cots. For 2p, one could sleep sitting upright on a bench, leaning against a rope strung across the room. Those who had no money at all slept in doorways, under bridges, in any corner where the police might not rouse them. Children often had no beds at all. They slept on floors, under tables, curled against their parents for warmth. In winter, many froze. In summer, disease swept through the crowded rooms with terrifying speed. Cholera, typhus, scarlet fever, smallpox. These were not abstract threats, but regular visitors, claiming lives by the hundreds. Work in the East End was brutal and unending. The docks employed thousands, men who loaded and unloaded ships from dawn until dark, their backs bent under sacks of grain, crates of goods, barrels of rum and wine. The pay was measured in shillings per day, and even that was not guaranteed. Workers gathered each morning at the dock gates, hoping to be selected by the foreman, competing for jobs that might last a few hours or a full day. Those not chosen went hungry. The factories were no better. Match factories where women and girls worked with white phosphorus that rotted their jaws. Tanneries where men stood ankle-deep in chemicals that burned their skin. Slaughterhouses where the floors ran red and the air was thick with the smell of blood and offal. The work was dangerous, the conditions dire. But it was work. And work meant survival. Children laboured alongside adults. There were no laws protecting them, no regulations limiting their hours or the tasks they might be required to perform. A child of 7 might work 12 hours a day in a factory, standing at a machine, performing the same repetitive task until exhaustion drove them to collapse. They swept chimneys, their small bodies perfect for navigating the narrow flues, their lungs blackened by soot. They worked as mudlarks, wading into the Thames at low tide to scavenge for coal, rope, nails, anything that could be sold for a few pennies. They begged, they stole. They did whatever was necessary to contribute to their family's meagre income. Education was a luxury most could not afford. A few charitable schools existed, run by churches or philanthropic societies, but attendance was sporadic. When the choice was between sending a child to school or sending them to work for pennies that might buy bread, the decision was not difficult. The streets themselves were a world of their own. They twisted and turned without logic, following the paths laid down centuries before when Whitechapel had been fields and the city had been small. Names had been given and forgotten, and given again. Dorset Street, the worst street in London, some called it, was lined with lodging houses and public houses, where violence was commonplace and murder not infrequent. Flower and Dean Street was little better. A rookery where criminals found shelter and police ventured only in pairs. The courts and alleys that branched off these main thoroughfares had no official names at all. Locals knew them by reputation: Miller's Court, George Yard, Thrall Street, places where the desperate and the criminal mingled, where life was cheap and death came easily. The infrastructure of the East End was primitive. Water came from public pumps, shared by hundreds, often contaminated by sewage that seeped through the ground from overflowing cesspits. Waste was collected irregularly, when it was collected at all. It piled in corners, in alleyways, rotting and reeking. The Thames itself was an open sewer, receiving the effluent of millions, its waters brown and thick, its smell overpowering in warm weather. The great engineering projects that would eventually transform London's sanitation were underway. Joseph Bazalgette's massive sewer system was being constructed, tunnels being dug beneath the streets to carry waste away to treatment plants downriver. But in 1807 the work was incomplete. The East End still lived as it had for generations, with filth and disease as constant companions. The police presence in these districts was thin. The Metropolitan Police, established in 1829, had brought some order to London, but their resources were stretched. A single constable might be responsible for patrolling an area covering several square miles, walking his beat alone through streets where he was viewed with suspicion at best, hostility at worst. The poor did not trust the police. They saw them as enforcers of laws designed to protect property and privilege, not people. When crimes occurred, and they occurred constantly, thefts and assaults and murders, they often went unreported. Justice was something that happened elsewhere, in courts where the accused had no voice and no defence. The East End policed itself through rough justice and communal memory, through knowing who could be trusted and who could not. Into this world, into this landscape of poverty and struggle, the children of 1807 were born. They arrived in rooms without light, delivered by midwives who charged sixpence and asked no questions. Many did not survive infancy. Those who did grew quickly, hardened by circumstances that would have seemed unimaginable to children born into wealth. They learned to navigate the streets, to recognise danger, to move through the fog and the darkness with the confidence of those who had no choice. They were not innocent in the way that childhood is often romanticised. They had seen too much, endured too much. But they were children nonetheless, with the same capacity for joy, for play, for hope that children have always possessed. And now, in the autumn of 1867, these children were disappearing. Not because of disease or accident or the ordinary tragedies that claimed so many young lives in the East End, but because something was taking them. Something that moved through the fog, that struck without warning, that left no trace. The city that had always been indifferent to their suffering was beginning to take notice, not because it cared particularly for the lives of poor children, but because the pattern of disappearances suggested something organised, something deliberate, something that threatened the fragile order upon which even the poorest districts depended. The fog continued to roll in from the river. The gaslights continued to burn low, and in the narrow courts and alleys of Whitechapel, parents held their children close and wondered if morning would come. Chapter 3. The First Searches. The search for the missing children began in earnest in the second week of November. By then the number had climbed to 28, and the newspapers had begun to demand action. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Richard Mayne, ordered additional constables assigned to the Whitechapel division. Detective inspectors from Scotland Yard were dispatched to coordinate the investigation. Notices were posted on walls and lamp-posts throughout the East End asking anyone with information to come forward. Rewards were offered, small sums, a few pounds at most, but enough to tempt those who lived on the edge of starvation. The police stations on Commercial Street and Leman Street became gathering points for families desperate for news, for any sign that their children might be found alive. The searches followed predictable patterns. Constables walked the streets in pairs, questioning residents, knocking on doors, checking the dark corners where a child might hide or be hidden. They searched abandoned buildings, warehouses left empty by bankrupt businesses, cellars and attics and coal holes. They combed through the communal lodging houses, examining the books kept by the proprietors, looking for names that might match the missing. They checked the workhouses, those grim institutions where the destitute were sent to labour in exchange for meagre food and shelter. They visited hospitals and infirmaries, inquiring whether any unidentified children had been admitted. They even descended to the river, questioning the watermen who worked the Thames, the mudlarks who scavenged its banks, asking if any had seen children near the water in the hours before they vanished. The families of the missing conducted their own searches. Mothers walked the streets calling names until their voices failed. Fathers pooled their pennies to print handbills describing their lost children, distributing them in markets and outside churches. Siblings formed groups, moving through alleys and courts, checking places adults might overlook. The searches were desperate, chaotic, driven by a hope that faded with each passing day. They found nothing. No bodies were discovered in the river or the streets. No children were found locked in cellars or hidden in attics. It was as if the missing had been erased from existence, plucked from the world and deposited somewhere beyond reach. The lack of bodies was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the disappearances. In a city where death was commonplace, where corpses were found regularly in the Thames or the streets, the complete absence of remains suggested something deliberate. Bodies could be hidden, of course. They could be weighted and thrown into the river to sink beyond recovery. They could be buried in unmarked graves, burned in factory furnaces, dismembered and scattered. But such methods required planning, resources, time. To make 28 children vanish without leaving a single trace spoke to an organisation and ruthlessness that went beyond ordinary crime. The police began to develop theories. The most prevalent involved the resurrection men, those who supplied medical schools with cadavers for anatomical study. The trade had been legal since 1832, when the Anatomy Act allowed unclaimed bodies from workhouses to be used for dissection. But demand still exceeded supply, and a black market persisted. Resurrection men had once robbed graves to obtain bodies. Might they now be taking living children, killing them, and selling their corpses to unscrupulous surgeons? The theory had a certain logic. Medical schools existed throughout London, each requiring a steady supply of bodies for teaching. A child's body would be easier to transport than an adult's, less likely to be recognised if certain identifying features were removed. The police visited medical schools, questioned anatomists, examined records of bodies received. They found nothing suspicious. The school administrators were cooperative, even helpful, opening their dissection rooms to inspection. No evidence of recently murdered children was discovered. Another theory involved white slavers, those who trafficked in human beings. The trade was well known, though rarely prosecuted. Young women were lured or kidnapped and shipped abroad to brothels in Europe, South America, the Orient. Might children be taken for similar purposes? The theory was discussed in hushed tones, too disturbing to examine too closely. The police made inquiries at the docks, questioned ship captains, examined passenger manifests. They found nothing. No ships had departed with unusual numbers of children aboard. No captains reported suspicious cargo. The trail, such as it was, led nowhere. The detective inspectors assigned to the case worked methodically through the evidence, such as it was. They constructed timelines for each disappearance, mapping the locations, noting the times, searching for patterns. They interviewed witnesses repeatedly, pressing them for details they might have forgotten or overlooked. They compiled lists of known criminals, thieves, assaulters, those convicted of crimes against children, and tracked them down, questioning them, verifying their whereabouts on the nights when children had vanished. None proved promising. The criminals had alibis, or were in custody when disappearances occurred, or were deemed incapable of the level of organisation required. One inspector, a man named Frederick Abberline, who would later achieve fame investigating the Whitechapel murders of 1888, focused on the geography of the disappearances. He obtained a map of the district and marked each location with a pin. The pattern that emerged was troubling. The disappearances clustered near the river, in a band roughly half a mile wide that stretched from the Tower of London in the west to Shadwell in the east. They occurred in streets that led toward the Thames, in alleys that provided access to the wharves. The fog, when it rolled in from the river, was thickest in these areas, so dense that visibility dropped to a few feet. Abberline theorised that whoever was taking the children knew the streets intimately, knew which routes provided cover, which alleys led to the water, which times of day offered the least chance of witnesses. He also noted the timing. The disappearances occurred most frequently in the early evening, in that window between dusk and full darkness when children were still on the streets but visibility was already compromised by the fading light and the rising fog. They occurred on weekdays more often than weekends, when working families sent children on errands and adults were less likely to be watching. They occurred during the new moon, when the nights were darkest and even the feeble light of the stars was absent. Whoever was responsible was choosing their moments carefully, waiting for conditions that favoured concealment and speed. Abberline compiled his findings into a report and presented it to his superiors. He recommended concentrating patrols in the riverside areas, particularly during the evening hours when fog was forecast. He suggested using plainclothes officers to watch the streets unobtrusively, hoping to catch the culprit in the act. He proposed recruiting local residents, offering them small payments to act as additional eyes and ears. His recommendations were approved, and the police presence in Whitechapel increased. Constables began patrolling in greater numbers. Plainclothes detectives positioned themselves on street corners, in doorways, anywhere that provided a view of the main thoroughfares. Local men were paid $1 a night to watch their own streets and report anything suspicious. For a week, the increased patrols seemed to work. No new disappearances were reported. The families began to hope that perhaps the danger had passed, that whoever had been taking children had been frightened off by the police presence. The newspapers ran stories praising the Metropolitan Police for their swift action. The Commissioner issued a statement expressing cautious optimism. Then, on the night of November 19th, 3 more children vanished. All 3 disappeared within an hour of one another, all 3 from streets that were being actively patrolled. One vanished from a court that had a constable standing at its entrance. The constable had been watching the street, had seen no one enter or leave, yet when a mother called for her daughter to come inside, the girl was gone. The constable had heard nothing, seen nothing. The fog that night had been particularly thick, rolling off the river in waves, reducing visibility to arm's length. The girl had simply ceased to exist. The police were baffled. The families were terrified. The theories multiplied. Some began to speak of the supernatural, of ghosts that walked in fog and stole children for purposes beyond human understanding. The penny dreadfuls published stories of vengeful spirits, of demons that preyed on the innocent, of ancient curses that had awakened in the heart of the city. The rational dismissed such talk as superstition, but in the narrow courts of Whitechapel, where life was hard and explanations were few, people began to wonder. The fog continued to roll in, the children continued to disappear, and the searches, for all their thoroughness, for all the police attention and public outcry, yielded nothing but frustration and fear. Chapter 4. Theories and Superstitions. In the tenements and lodging houses of Whitechapel, in the public houses where men gathered after their shifts, in the markets where women haggled over vegetables and scraps of meat, the talk turned obsessively to the missing children. The official investigation continued, methodical and plodding, constables walking their beats, detectives compiling their reports. But among the people who lived in the shadow of the disappearances, who sent their children into streets that had become hunting grounds, other explanations took root. Some were grounded in the known evils of the world. Others reached toward darker possibilities, toward forces that operated beyond the realm of law and reason. The resurrection men remained the most popular theory among those who sought rational explanations. The trade in bodies was well known, discussed in whispers but acknowledged as a grim reality of urban life. Everyone knew the stories. Graves robbed in the night, coffins opened, bodies stolen and sold to anatomists who asked no questions about where they came from. The practice had been more common, decades earlier, before the Anatomy Act, but many believed it continued. The medical schools needed bodies. The supply of unclaimed corpses from workhouses and hospitals was insufficient. Where else would they come from? The theory gained adherents not because of evidence, but because it made a terrible kind of sense. Children's bodies would be easier to transport than adults. They would be less likely to be missed in a district where death was common. They could be killed quietly, efficiently, without the messiness of grave robbing. Some elaborated on the theory. They spoke of organised gangs, networks that operated across the city, identifying victims, arranging their capture, delivering them to surgeons who paid well for fresh specimens. They spoke of carriages that came in the Night, dark vehicles with curtained windows that collected the bodies and transported them to dissection rooms in the teaching hospitals. They spoke of men who watched the streets during the day, noting which children were vulnerable, which families were too poor or too broken to make effective complaints to the police. The details varied with each telling, but the core remained the same. Children were being murdered for profit, their bodies sold to feed the appetites of medical science. The police investigated these rumours thoroughly. They visited every medical school in London, interviewed anatomists and demonstrators, examined the bodies in dissection rooms. They found nothing. The schools kept meticulous records documenting the source of every cadaver, recording the dates of receipt and the manner of death. All were accounted for. All had come through legal channels, workhouses, hospitals, prisons. No recently murdered children appeared in their inventories. Some anatomists expressed outrage at the suggestion, noting that their profession, while necessarily dealing with death, was bound by strict ethical standards. Others were more pragmatic, acknowledging that while body snatching had occurred in the past, the Anatomy Act had made such practices unnecessary. The evidence, such as it was, did not support the theory, but in the courts and alleys of Whitechapel, where trust in authority was minimal, the lack of evidence was seen as proof of conspiracy, not innocence. White slavers provided another explanation. The trade in human beings was not confined to history or distant shores. It existed in London, in the great port city where ships arrived from every corner of the globe. Young women disappeared with disturbing regularity, lured by promises of employment, drugged, shipped abroad to brothels in continental Europe or South America, or the colonies. The trade was known, occasionally prosecuted, but never effectively suppressed. If women could be taken, why not children? The theory held that children were being kidnapped and sold to wealthy perverts, to foreign buyers whose tastes ran to the young and vulnerable. They would be shipped out through the docks, hidden in cargo, documented as goods rather than people. Once beyond English waters, they would vanish into networks that could never be penetrated. The police investigated the docks with renewed intensity. They questioned ship captains, examined manifests, searched holds and cabins. They interviewed dock workers, asking about suspicious cargo, about ships that departed at unusual hours, about anyone who might be involved in smuggling human beings. They found nothing concrete. Ships left the docks constantly, bound for destinations across the world. Cargo was loaded and unloaded in chaotic profusion. To track every crate, every barrel, every trunk was impossible. Some captains were evasive, unwilling to discuss their business with the authorities. Others were cooperative but unhelpful, genuinely ignorant of their ships being used for such purposes. The investigation yielded no arrests, no recoveries, no proof that the theory was correct. But neither did it prove the theory wrong. As the rational explanations failed to produce results, other voices grew louder. These were older voices, rooted in beliefs that predated the industrial city, that reached back to times when the world had been explained through gods and spirits rather than science and reason. In the East End, where poverty and hardship created conditions not far removed from medieval life, such beliefs had never entirely disappeared. They lived in the minds of the old, in the stories told to children, in the practices that persisted despite the scorn of the educated. Now, as the disappearances continued and no earthly explanation seemed adequate, people began to wonder if something beyond the natural world was responsible. Some spoke of ghosts. London was an ancient city built atop layers of earlier settlements, Roman and Saxon and Norman. Its ground was saturated with the dead, thousands upon thousands buried in churchyards and plague pits and forgotten graves. Perhaps something had awakened, some restless spirit disturbed by the construction of the sewers, by the digging of the tunnels that now ran beneath the streets. Perhaps it walked in the fog seeking children to replace its own lost progeny, stealing them away to some liminal realm between life and death. The idea was not as fanciful as it might have seemed to outsiders. Many in the East End had experience with spiritualism, with mediums who claimed to contact the dead. with séances held in parlours and back rooms throughout the district. The barrier between the living and the dead was understood to be thin, permeable, easily crossed under the right circumstances. Others spoke of older things. In the markets and the public houses, old women whispered about the river. The Thames was old, older than London, older than memory. It had seen civilizations rise and fall, had carried the bodies of the drowned for thousands of years. Perhaps it demanded tribute, as rivers once had, as the ancient gods had required. Perhaps the fog was the river's breath, and what walked in the fog was the river's agent, collecting what was owed. Children had always been the most valuable offerings, the most precious gifts to angry gods. Perhaps the Thames remembered, and had grown hungry again. There were stories, too, about the Ripper's grandfather, a phrase that would be whispered in the same streets 20 years later when Jack the Ripper claimed his victims. People spoke of a figure that had appeared in earlier generations during other times of fog and fear, always taking children, always vanishing before capture. Some claimed to remember hearing similar stories from their grandparents, tales of children stolen in the fog decades before. The details were vague, perhaps invented, perhaps misremembered, but they fed the growing sense that whatever was happening had happened before, that London was caught in a cycle that repeated across generations. The supernatural theories were dismissed by the educated, by the police, by the newspapers that served the middle and upper classes. They were seen as the superstitions of the ignorant, the desperate attempts of simple minds to explain events they could not comprehend. But in the streets where the children were vanishing, where mothers held their sons and daughters and prayed to whatever might be listening, the theories did not seem unreasonable. The world was a mysterious place, full of forces that could not be seen or understood. The fog itself seemed alive, seemed to have purpose and intention. Why should it not conceal something beyond human comprehension? Why should the modern age, with all its industry and progress, be immune to the ancient terrors that had haunted humanity since the beginning of time? The churches attempted to provide comfort. Vicars preached sermons about faith in times of trial, about trusting in God's plan, about the promise of reunion in heaven for those who had lost children. The Catholic churches held special masses. The charitable societies increased their efforts, distributing food and coal to families affected by the disappearances, offering small payments to those who had lost wage-earning children. But religion provided cold comfort to those whose children had been taken. God seemed very distant, and the fog very close. The gaslight burned in the churches as they did in the streets, casting inadequate light against the darkness, and in that darkness, something continued to move, something that took children and left only silence and grief in its wake. Chapter 5. The Pattern Revealed. The investigation reached a turning point in late November, not through brilliant deduction or fortunate discovery, but through the patient accumulation of detail. Detective Inspector Frederick Abberline had spent weeks compiling information, recording every aspect of each disappearance in ledgers that grew thick with notations. He marked dates and times, weather conditions, locations, the circumstances surrounding each vanishing. He interviewed witnesses repeatedly, extracting details that seemed trivial in isolation, but gained significance when viewed as part of a larger whole. He walked the streets himself, at different hours, in different conditions, trying to understand the geography as the perpetrator must understand it. Gradually a pattern emerged from the chaos. The disappearances occurred only at night, never during daylight hours. This much had been obvious from the beginning. But Abberline noticed something more specific. They occurred only when fog was present, and not just any fog, but the thick, impenetrable murk that rolled off the Thames in dense banks. On nights when the air was clear, or when only light mist hung in the streets, no children vanished. The correlation was absolute. Every summer, single disappearance had occurred during heavy fog conditions. This suggested someone who either waited for such nights or who possessed knowledge of when they would occur. Abberline consulted with the meteorological office, asking if fog could be predicted. The scientists there told him that while patterns existed, reliable prediction was impossible. Fog formed when conditions of temperature and humidity aligned in particular ways, often with little warning. Yet someone seemed to know when these conditions would arrive. The timing within each foggy night was equally precise. Abberline calculated that 90% of disappearances occurred between the hours of 5 in the evening and 8 at night. This was the period when working families sent children on errands, when the streets were busy with people returning from labour, when the transition from day to night created maximum confusion. It was not the deepest part of night, when the streets emptied and anyone abroad would be noticed. It was the busy time when one more figure in the fog would attract no attention, when children moved through the streets as they always did. The perpetrator understood the rhythms of the district, knew when to strike for maximum opportunity and minimum risk. The locations formed a band along the river. Abberline's map showed this clearly. Every disappearance had occurred within half a mile of the Thames, in streets that provided relatively direct access to the wharves and docks. The children had not been taken from the interior courts, the deep warrens where the poorest lived in the greatest density. They had been taken from thoroughfares, from streets that connected the residential areas to the river. This suggested movement towards the water, suggested that whatever was done with the children involved the Thames or the buildings along its banks, the warehouses, the workshops, the counting houses, the lodging houses that catered to sailors and transient workers. All of these lined the riverside, providing countless places where children could be hidden or held. Abberline also noticed a lunar pattern. The disappearances clustered around the new moon, when the nights were darkest. During the full moon, even fog could not entirely eliminate visibility. The reflected light from the moon penetrated the murk to some degree, providing enough illumination that movement could be detected. But during the new moon, when no celestial light existed, the fog became absolute. Abberline marked the phases of the moon on his calendar and overlaid them with the disappearance dates. The correlation was striking. Whoever was taking children understood astronomy, or at least possessed enough practical knowledge to choose the darkest nights for their activities. The number of children taken on any given night varied. Sometimes it was 1, sometimes 2 or 3. Once, on the night of November 19th, 5 had vanished within a 3-hour window. Abberline studied these variations, searching for meaning. He concluded that the number taken depended on opportunity rather than quota. The perpetrator took whatever targets presented themselves on nights when conditions were favourable. This suggested opportunism rather than ritual, practical predation rather than symbolic action. It also suggested someone working alone or with minimal assistance. A large gang would be more systematic, would take children according to a plan rather than as chance allowed. The children themselves shared certain characteristics. They were all between the ages of 6 and 13, old enough to be out alone, but young enough to be easily overpowered. They were all from the poorest families, children who wore ragged clothes and went barefoot even in cold weather, children whose absence might be reported to police, but who would never command the attention that missing middle-class children would receive. They were expendable in the cruel calculation of Victorian society. Their lives had little value in official eyes. The perpetrator understood this. Selected victims who would generate minimal pressure on the police, whose disappearances would be tragic but not scandalous. Abberline presented his findings to his superiors at Scotland Yard. He argued that the pattern revealed someone with intimate knowledge of the district, someone who lived or worked in the area, someone who understood the streets and the people well enough to move among them invisibly. The fog provided cover, but cover alone was not enough. The perpetrator needed to know which streets would be busy, which alleys provided escape routes, which corners had no lamps, which buildings had unlocked doors or accessible cellars. This knowledge could only come from long familiarity. Abberline recommended that the investigation focus on local residents, particularly those who had reason to be on the streets during the hours when disappearances occurred. A list was compiled. It included night watchmen, those employed to guard warehouses and workshops after dark. It included dock workers who laboured through the evening shifts. It included publicans and their employees, cabmen waiting at stands, street vendors who sold food and drink to workers leaving the factories. It included clergy who visited the sick and dying at all hours. It included the keepers of lodging houses who stayed awake through the night to admit late arrivals. It included constables themselves, those who walked the beats and knew every corner of their patrol areas. The list grew to over 300 names. Each would need to be investigated, their movements verified, their backgrounds examined for anything that might suggest involvement in the disappearances. The investigation expanded. Teams of detectives visited homes and workplaces, asking questions, taking statements, requesting alibis for the nights when children had vanished. Most of those interviewed were cooperative, understanding they were not suspect, but potential witnesses. Some were defensive, resentful of the implication that they might be involved in such horrors. A few refused to speak to police at all, maintaining the traditional East End suspicion of authority. The interviews produced mountains of information, but little that seemed useful. Most of those questioned had alibis, or at least claimed they did. Verifying these claims proved difficult. The East End was a place where people lied routinely to protect themselves and their neighbours, where official questions were met with official answers that revealed nothing. One category on the list attracted particular attention. Several men had been employed as attendants at the local workhouse infirmary until recently, when they had been dismissed for various infractions. These men would have experience handling the weak and the vulnerable. They would have become inured to suffering, perhaps even comfortable with it. They would understand how bodies could be moved, how death could be concealed, how records could be falsified. The police tracked down 4 such men. 3 had left London entirely, finding work in other cities. The 4th had died in October before the disappearances began. The lead proved empty. Another possibility involved sailors. The docks teemed with men from every nation, arriving on ships and remaining in London for days or weeks before departing again. They lived in lodging houses near the river, drank in the riverside public houses, wandered the streets during their shore leave. Many were rough men, accustomed to violence, familiar with foreign lands where human life held little value. Could one of them be responsible? The police examined shipping records, trying to correlate the presence of particular ships with the dates of disappearances. They found no clear connection. Dozens of ships arrived and departed each week. Crews changed constantly. Tracking individual sailors proved nearly impossible. As December arrived, the pattern continued to hold. Fog came on the 3rd of the month, thick and cold, and 2 more children vanished. Fog came again on the 8th, and another was taken. On the 14th, during particularly dense fog that lasted 2 full days, 4 children disappeared. The police presence had been increased to the point where constables were visible on nearly every corner, yet still the children vanished. It was as if the perpetrator could see through the fog while others were blind, as if he moved through a world that existed parallel to the normal streets, a world where police and witnesses simply did not exist. The newspapers began to criticise the Metropolitan Police openly. The Times ran an editorial questioning the competence of the investigation. The Morning Chronicle suggested that perhaps the police themselves were complicit, that corruption within the ranks allowed the perpetrator to operate with impunity. The penny dreadfuls published increasingly lurid accounts, complete with illustrations of shadowy figures leading children into darkness. Public meetings were held in churches and assembly halls, where residents demanded action, where speakers denounced the authorities for their failure to protect the most vulnerable. The pressure on the police became intense. Abberline remained focused on the pattern. He believed that understanding how the crimes were committed would lead to understanding who was committing them. The fog was key. The proximity to the river was key. The timing was key. But he lacked the final piece, the connection that would make sense of all the accumulated detail. He walked the streets at night, standing in fog so thick he could barely see his own hands, trying to understand how someone moved through such conditions with confidence and speed. He visited the riverside, watched the dark water sliding past, listened to the sounds of the docks, the creaking of ships, the splash of oars, the calls of watermen working through the darkness. The river seemed almost alive, seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. And somewhere in the fog, somewhere along those dark streets that led to the water, something continued to hunt. Chapter 6. The Ripper's Predecessor. The phrase appeared first in a letter to the editor published in the Illustrated Police News on December the 10th. The writer, identifying himself only as a long-time resident of Whitechapel, made a startling claim. He remembered, or claimed to remember, similar disappearances occurring decades earlier, in the 1830s, when he had been a child himself. Children had vanished then too, he wrote, always in fog, always near the river, always without trace. The police had never solved those cases. The disappearances had continued for several months before stopping as suddenly as they had begun. The pattern, he suggested, was repeating itself. Perhaps the same person was responsible, or perhaps something else, something that appeared in cycles, emerging from whatever darkness had spawned it to claim victims across generations. The letter was dismissed by most as the rambling of an old man whose memory had grown unreliable with age. The police made no official comment, but in the streets of Whitechapel, the letter was discussed and debated. Other old residents came forward with similar claims. A woman in her 70s swore her younger brother had vanished in 1834, taken by what her parents had called the fog walker. A man in his 60s remembered his grandmother speaking of children who had disappeared during her youth, back in the early years of the century. The stories were vague, details lost to time, but they shared common elements. Fog, the river, children taken without warning or trace, and a sense that whatever was responsible operated according to its own timetable, appearing and disappearing like the fog itself. The newspapers began to use the phrase, the fog walker became shorthand for the unknown perpetrator, a name that captured something of the mystery and the horror. It suggested something not quite human, something that belonged to the fog and the river rather than to the daylight world. The penny dreadfuls seized upon the name with enthusiasm, publishing stories that transformed the crimes into gothic melodrama. The fog walker became a supernatural entity in these accounts, a demon or ghost that fed on innocence, that had haunted London since ancient times, that could never be caught because it was not of this world. The stories were absurd, but they sold in enormous quantities. Fear and sensation made for profitable reading. In later years, when another series of murders terrorised the same streets, when Jack the Ripper claimed his victim in 1888, some would remember the fog walker and draw connections. They would note that both sets of crimes occurred in Whitechapel, both involved the poor and vulnerable, both remained unsolved. They would speak of the Ripper's grandfather, suggesting a lineage of horror that stretched back through his heads. The connection was spurious, based on geography rather than evidence, but it would persist in the folklore of the East End. The fog walker and the Ripper would be linked in memory, two manifestations of whatever darkness dwelt in those narrow streets. But in December of 1867, the Ripper was still 2 decades in the future, an unknown entity who might have been a child himself, or not yet born, or walking the same streets where the fog walker hunted. The present horror was sufficient without borrowing from the future. 43 children had vanished by mid-December. 43 families had been shattered. The fog continued to arrive with predictable irregularity, and with it came the certainty that more would be taken. The police intensified their efforts. Commissioner Mayne authorised overtime payments, allowing constables to work double shifts. Plainclothes officers were positioned throughout the district, instructed to watch for anything unusual, anyone who moved through the fog with unusual confidence or purpose. Local men continued to be recruited as watchers, paid their shillings to stand vigil over their own streets. The theory was that saturation coverage would eventually reveal the perpetrator, that even someone skilled at moving invisibly would make a mistake, would be seen, would leave some trace that could be followed. On the night of December 17th, the fog came again. It rolled off the river in great banks, swallowing the gaslights, reducing visibility to nothing. The police presence was heavy. Constables stood on every major corner. Plainclothes detectives watched from doorways and windows. The paid watchers took their positions. The entire district seemed to hold its breath, waiting. By midnight, 3 children had vanished. All 3 had been on streets that were actively patrolled. All three had disappeared in the air, moments between one constable passing and another arriving. It was as if the fog walker could sense the police presence, could avoid it with uncanny precision, could slip through the net no matter how tightly it was drawn. One constable, a young man named William Thorne, who'd been on the force less than a year, reported seeing something that night. He had been standing at the corner of Flower and Dean Street, watching the fog swirl under the gaslight, when he heard footsteps. They were soft, almost inaudible, but distinct. Someone was approaching through the fog. Thorne readied his whistle, prepared to challenge whoever emerged. The footsteps grew closer, then they stopped. Thorne waited, straining his eyes against the grey. He saw nothing. He heard nothing more. After several minutes he moved forward carefully, his bullseye lantern raised. The street was empty. He walked its length, examining doorways and alleys. There was no one, yet he had heard footsteps. He was certain of it. His report was filed with dozens of others, accounts of sounds heard, shadows glimpsed, presences sensed but never confirmed. The fog played tricks on perception. Sound carried strangely through the murk. Shadows appeared where no physical object could account for them. The mind, under stress, invented dangers that might not exist. Yet the children were disappearing. Someone was taking them. The reports might be unreliable individually, but collectively they suggested something. Someone was moving through the fog with extraordinary skill. Someone who understood how to avoid detection, even when the streets were filled with watchers. Abberline reviewed Thorne's report with interest. The location was significant. Flower and Dean Street was one of the worst streets in the district, lined with lodging houses that catered to criminals and transients. It was also close to the river, connected to the wharves by several alleys and courts. If someone was taking children toward the water, Flower and Dean Street would be a logical route. Abberline interviewed Thorne personally, pressing him for details. The constable was earnest, convinced of what he had heard, even if he could not explain what had happened. Abberline made a note. It was one more piece of information, potentially significant or potentially meaningless. The investigation had by now consumed enormous resources. Hundreds of man-hours had been spent interviewing witnesses, searching buildings, patrolling streets. The financial cost was substantial. Commissioner Mayne faced pressure from the Home Office to either solve the case or scale back the operation. The resources being devoted to missing children from the East End were resources that could not be used elsewhere. Other crimes were occurring throughout London. Other cases required attention. The East End was important, but it was not the only part of the city that needed policing. Mayne resisted the pressure. He understood that if the police withdrew, if they admitted defeat, the consequences would extend beyond the immediate tragedy. The Metropolitan Police had been established to bring order to London, to demonstrate that even the poorest districts could be made safe through modern policing methods. To fail so completely, to allow dozens of children to be taken without apprehending the perpetrator, would undermine public confidence in the entire institution. The case had to be solved, or at least had to be pursued with sufficient vigour that the public could see the police were doing everything possible. As December advanced toward Christmas, the mood in Whitechapel grew increasingly grim. The season that should have brought some measure of joy, however modest, was overshadowed by fear and grief. The churches prepared for their services, decorating altars with evergreen branches, rehearsing carols, planning special masses for the poor. The charitable societies increased their distributions of food and fuel. The wealthy, moved by newspaper accounts of the suffering, donated money to relief funds. But no amount of charity could address the fundamental horror. Children were being taken. No one could stop it. No one even knew who was doing it or why. Parents kept their children indoors whenever possible. The streets, usually filled with the noise and movement of young people, grew quieter. Schools reported near-perfect attendance, not from any sudden enthusiasm for education, but from parental fear. The few children who did venture out moved in tight groups, holding hands, calling to one another constantly to ensure no one had fallen behind. The Christmas markets, normally bustling with families, attracted fewer customers. The fog hung over everything, literal and metaphorical. a presence that could not be escaped or ignored. On December the 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, the fog returned with unusual intensity. It arrived in the afternoon, earlier than usual, and showed no signs of lifting as evening approached. The police braced for another wave of disappearances. Every available constable was deployed. Abberline himself took to the streets, walking through the grey, listening, watching, hoping to see what others had missed. The night passed slowly. Midnight came and went. Then 1 in the morning, then 2. By 3, when the darkness began to lighten slightly toward dawn, no disappearances had been reported. By full morning it was confirmed. For the first time since the pattern had begun, a foggy night had passed without children being taken. The respite was brief. On Christmas Day itself, fog came again in the evening, and with it the fog walker returned. 3 children vanished before midnight. The investigation continued, the pattern held, and in the streets of Whitechapel, hope, such as it was, died a little more. Chapter 7. The river yields its secrets. Winter deepened over London. January brought cold that settled into the bones, frost that turned the cobblestones treacherous, winds that cut through the thinnest walls of the tenements. The Thames, which never froze entirely due to the tides and the constant traffic, nonetheless grew sluggish. Ice formed along its edges, in the quiet backwaters and inlets where the current moved slowly. The water level dropped during particularly cold periods, exposing banks and mud flats that were normally submerged. It was during one such low tide, on the morning of January 14th, that the river began to yield its secrets. The mudlarks were the first to find them. These were the children and old people who scavenged the Thames at low tide, wading through the mud and refuse in search of anything that could be sold. Coal that had fallen from barges, pieces of rope, nails and metal scraps, copper coins occasionally dropped from the pockets of those who worked the river. The mudlarks knew the river intimately, knew where objects collected, knew how to read the patterns of deposition and erosion. They worked quickly during the hours when the tide was out, racing against the water's return, their feet bare despite the cold, their hands blackened by the filth they sifted through. A girl of perhaps 10, one of the regular mudlarks who worked the stretch of river between London Bridge and Tower Bridge, found the first remains. She had been digging in the mud near a drainage outlet, a place where objects often collected, when her hands encountered something that was not coal or metal or wood. She pulled it free from the sucking mud and stared at it for a moment before understanding what she held. It was small, delicate, unmistakably human. A child's hand severed at the wrist, the flesh pale and partially decomposed but still recognisable. The girl dropped it with a cry and scrambled back, slipping in the mud, her own hands now shaking. Other mudlarks heard her scream and came running. They found her sitting in the mud, pointing at the thing she had discovered. One of the older workers, a man who'd spent 40 years working the river, examined the hand without touching it. He recognised immediately what it meant. He sent a boy running to find the river police, while he and the others began searching the area more carefully. Within an hour they had found more. Another hand. A foot. Portions of limbs. All small, all belonging to children. The remains were scattered across a section of bank perhaps 30 yards long, buried in mud that had accumulated over weeks or months. The river police arrived with the morning tide still out. They brought constables from the nearby stations, detectives from Scotland Yard, even a surgeon from one of the hospitals to examine what had been found. The area was cordoned off with ropes. More officers arrived. The search expanded along the riverbank, moving slowly, carefully, examining every inch of exposed mud. By afternoon, when the tide began to return and forced the searchers to withdraw, they had recovered the remains of at least 6 children. The pieces were fragmentary, incomplete, but sufficient for identification of age and approximate time of death. The surgeon who examined them estimated they had been in the water for weeks, possibly months. The cold water had slowed decomposition, but the action of tides and scavengers had scattered and damaged the remains significantly. The news spread through Whitechapel before nightfall. The river had given up the missing children. Not all of them, perhaps not even most, but enough to confirm what many had suspected. The children were dead, had been dead all along, murdered and disposed of in the Thames. The hope that some might still be alive, held captive somewhere but recoverable, died with the discovery. The mourning that had been suspended, held back by uncertainty, now flooded forth. In tenement rooms throughout the district, families wept for children who would never return. The police conducted a more thorough search over the following days. They waited for low tides, brought in additional men, equipped them with tools for digging through mud and silt. They worked methodically along both banks of the Thames, focusing on the areas near Whitechapel and Shadwell where the river curved and the current created deposits. They found more remains. A skull here, bones there, pieces of clothing that had survived the water. By the end of January, they had recovered fragments belonging to at least 14 children. The identifications were difficult. The remains were often incomplete, and many of the missing children had no records, no photographs, nothing that would allow for certain matching. But the ages were right, the sizes were consistent, and the number was close enough to the number missing to make clear that these were the lost children of the autumn fog. The manner of death could not be determined with certainty. The surgeon examined the bones for marks that might indicate violence, cuts from knives, fractures from blows, anything that would suggest how the children had been killed. He found little. Strangulation might leave no marks on bone. Suffocation would leave none. Drowning would leave none. The children could have been killed in any number of ways before being deposited in the river. The fragmentation and decomposition made detailed analysis impossible. All that could be said with certainty was that the children were dead, and that someone had put them in the Thames with sufficient weight to keep them submerged until the weights had detached or corroded away. The discovery changed the nature of the investigation. It was no longer a matter of finding missing children or preventing future abductions. It was now a murder investigation, one of the largest in London's history. The press coverage intensified. The Times ran the story on the front page. The Illustrated Police News published sketches of the riverbank search, showing constables digging in mud while others watched from boats. The penny seemed to ask crumbled. Dreadfuls outdid themselves with lurid accounts, complete with speculation about the methods of murder and the motivations of the killer. Public outrage grew. Meetings were held demanding justice. Questions were asked in Parliament about what the police were doing to apprehend the sadness of the murderer. Abberline and his colleagues analysed the locations where remains had been found. They were not evenly distributed. They clustered in areas where the river's current created natural collection points, places where objects floating downstream would be deposited as the tides ebbed and flowed. Working backward from these locations, trying to account for the movement of objects in tidal water, they calculated possible points where the bodies had entered the river. The calculations were imprecise. Tidal currents were complex, affected by the shape of the riverbed, the presence of piers and bridges, the volume of water flowing downstream. But the calculations suggested that the bodies had been deposited somewhere between Tower Bridge and Shadwell, a stretch of river lined with wharves and warehouses, exactly the area where the pattern of disappearances had been concentrated. The warehouses became the focus of renewed attention. There were dozens of them, massive brick structures that lined the river, used for storing goods from the ships that docked at the wharves. Some were owned by large companies and maintained secure operations. Others were rented to smaller merchants, divided into sections, accessible to anyone who paid the fees. The police obtained permission to search them, bringing constables and detectives in force, examining every floor, every room, every corner. They found nothing of obvious relevance. The warehouses contained what they should contain: goods awaiting shipment, goods recently arrived, the ordinary commerce of empire. No blood-stained rooms, no chambers equipped for murder, no evidence that children had been held or killed within their walls. But the warehouses remained suspicious. They provided exactly what the murderer would need: access to the river, privacy from observation, space to work undisturbed. Many had direct access to the water through doors that opened onto the wharves. Some had cranes for loading and unloading cargo, equipment that could easily be used to deposit weighted bodies into the Thames. The workers who laboured in the warehouses were questioned extensively. Most were dock labourers, men who loaded and unloaded ships, who moved goods from vessels to storage and storage back to vessels. They worked at all hours, whenever ships arrived or departed. They were rough men, accustomed to hard labour, not particularly observant of matters that did not concern them directly. One warehouse attracted particular attention. It was owned by a merchant who dealt in imported timber, bringing wood from Scandinavia and the Baltic states for use in construction throughout London. The warehouse was large, 3 stories high, with direct access to a wharf where ships could dock and unload. The merchant employed several permanent workers, but during busy periods he hired additional labour from the men who gathered each morning at the dock gates hoping for work. This meant that dozens of different men might have access to the warehouse on any given day, any of whom could potentially use the facility for purposes other than storing timber. The police interviewed the merchant and his permanent workers. All claimed to know nothing about missing children or bodies in the river. The merchant expressed outrage at the suggestion his property might have been used for such purposes. He provided records of who had been employed and when, but the records were incomplete, particularly for the casual labourers hired for short periods. The police examined the warehouse thoroughly, searching for any evidence that crimes had been committed there. They found nothing definitive. Old stains on the floor might have been blood or might have been from the timber itself, which often leaked sap and tannins. Rope and chain used for moving cargo might have been used to weight bodies, but then similar rope and chain could be found in dozens of warehouses along the river. The investigation continued through February. More remains were found as the tides shifted, and the riverbed revealed new sections. The count of confirmed dead reached 20 children whose fragments had been recovered and identified with varying degrees of certainty. But the disappearances had totalled over 50 by the time they stopped. Where were the others? Still in the river, buried in mud that had not yet been exposed, disposed of elsewhere, in places the police had not yet searched? Or had some survived after all, taken for purposes other than murder, sold or transported beyond recovery? The questions had no answers. The families of the dead were notified when identifications could be made. In most cases, they had already accepted their children were gone. The discovery of remains confirmed what they had known in their hearts. Some requested the fragments for burial, others declined, unwilling to inner pieces when they could not have the whole. The funerals that were held were small, attended by family and neighbours, marked by a grief that had no adequate expression. The churches did what they could, offering services without charge, providing small coffins, speaking words of comfort that rang hollow against the enormity of loss. The children were buried in paupers' graves in corners of churchyards set aside for those who died without means, their markers simple wooden crosses that would rot and disappear within years. Chapter 8. The Suspect. The break in the case came not from brilliant detective work, but from the kind of chance observation that so often determines the course of investigations. On the night of February 23rd, a night watchman named Albert Geddes was making his rounds through a complex of warehouses near Shadwell Basin. Geddes was 60 years old, a former sailor who had spent 30 years at sea before age and injury had forced him to seek shore-based employment. He had worked as a night watchman for 5 years, walking the same route every night, checking locks, watching for fires or intruders, performing the mundane duties that kept the warehouses secure. The fog that night was moderate, not the impenetrable murk that had characterised the nights when children disappeared, but thick enough to muffle sound and obscure vision beyond 20 feet. Geddes carried a lantern and a stout club, standard equipment for his work. He had just checked the locks on a warehouse that stored tobacco when he heard something that made him pause. It was a sound like cloth dragging across stone, soft but distinct in the fog-wrapped silence. He turned toward the sound, raising his lantern. For a moment he saw nothing. Then a figure emerged from the fog, moving along the wharf that bordered the basin. The figure was tall, perhaps 6 feet, wearing a long dark coat that reached nearly to the ground. A hat was pulled low, obscuring the face. The man, Geddes was certain it was a man from the build and the gate, was walking with purpose, not hurrying but moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. He carried something in his arms, something wrapped in cloth or canvas. The bundle was not large, perhaps 3 feet long, cradled against his chest the way one might carry a sleeping child or a substantial parcel. Geddes called out, asking the man to identify himself. The figure stopped, turned toward him. For a moment they stood perhaps 15 feet apart, separated by the fog and the darkness. Geddes raised his lantern higher, trying to see the man's face. He had an impression of pale skin, dark eyes, something in the expression that was neither hostile nor friendly, but simply blank, devoid of emotion. Then the man turned and moved quickly toward the edge of the wharf. Before Geddes could react, before he could call out again or move to intercept, the figure reached the water and threw the bundle he carried. It arced through the air and splashed into the basin. The man then ran, disappearing into the fog with surprising speed. Geddes hurried to the edge of the wharf and looked down at the black water. He could see nothing. The splash had disturbed the surface, creating ripples that spread outward, but whatever had been thrown had already sunk. Geddes blew his whistle, and the shrill sound cutting through the fog, summoning help. Other watchmen from nearby buildings responded. Within minutes, several men had gathered at the wharf. Geddes explained what he had seen. One of the men, thinking quickly, ran to fetch a boat hook from a nearby shed. They lowered it into the water, sweeping it back and forth, hoping to snag whatever had been thrown in. After several attempts, the hook caught something. They pulled carefully, feeling resistance, then wait. The object broke the surface, water streaming from it. It was indeed a bundle, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with rope. They hauled it onto the wharf and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was the body of a child, a girl of perhaps 8 years old. She wore a thin dress, no shoes, her dark hair plastered to her skull by the water. Her skin was cold, her lips blue. She had been dead for some time, hours at least, possibly longer. Around her waist was tied a length of chain with a brick attached, weight sufficient to ensure she would sink and remain submerged. The police were summoned immediately. Constables arrived first, then detectives, then Abberline himself, roused from sleep by a messenger who pounded on his door with news that a body had been recovered and a suspect had been seen. By the time Abberline reached Shadwell Basin, dawn was beginning to break, grey light seeping through the fog. The child's body lay on the wharf, covered with a tarpaulin. Geddes and the other watchmen stood nearby, giving their statements to the constables who recorded every detail. Abberline questioned Geddes personally. The watchman was steady, his account clear and consistent. He described the figure he had seen, the height, the coat, the hat, the way the man had moved. He described the man's face as best he could remember it, though he admitted the fog and darkness had prevented detailed observation. Pale skin, dark eyes, or possibly just deep shadows where the eyes should be. No beard or moustache that he could recall. The age was difficult to determine. The build suggested someone neither young nor old, somewhere in the middle years of life, strong enough to carry the weight of a child and a brick without apparent effort. The description was general enough to match thousands of men in London, but it was more than the police had possessed before. For the first time they had a witness who had actually seen the perpetrator in the act of disposing a body. Geddes had interrupted the man, had prevented the body from sinking beyond recovery. The girl could be identified, her death could be examined. Perhaps something about her would lead back to the killer. The child was taken to the mortuary where the police surgeon conducted an examination. She was identified within days as Ellen Morrison, 9 years old, who had disappeared from a street in Shadwell on the evening of February 20th, 3 days before her body was recovered. She had been sent by her mother to fetch water from a public pump. She had never returned. The surgeon's examination revealed that she had been strangled. Marks on her neck showed where pressure had been applied, crushing her windpipe, cutting off air until death occurred. There were no signs of other violence, no indication of sexual assault, nothing beyond the strangulation itself. She had been killed efficiently, then kept somewhere for several days before being weighted, and thrown into the Beeton. The recovery of Ellen Morrison's body and Geddes' sighting generated renewed urgency in the investigation. The police now knew with certainty that at least one man was disposing of bodies in the Thames. The killer had been seen, had been described, however, generally. The area where he had been spotted, the warehouses and wharves around Shadwell Basin, could be searched more intensively. Abberline ordered every building within a quarter-mile of the basin to be examined. Every worker, every resident, every person who had a reason to be in the area was to be questioned. The searches began immediately and continued for days. Hundreds of men were interviewed. Their descriptions were compared to what Geddes had reported. Their movements on the night of February 23rd were verified, or at least questioned. Most could account for themselves. They had been at home, or at work in other locations, or in public houses where others could confirm their presence. But a few had no solid alibis. A few matched the general description closely enough to warrant further investigation. One man in particular attracted attention. His name was Thomas Wainwright. He was 42 years old, unmarried, employed as a casual labourer at various warehouses along the river. He had worked at the tobacco warehouse that Geddes had been checking on the night the body was thrown into the basin. He was tall, approximately 6 feet, with a build that matched Geddes' description. He owned a long dark coat. He had been seen in the area on the night in question, though he claimed he had been walking home to his lodgings in Wapping and had not been near Shadwell Basin itself. Wainwright's background was investigated thoroughly. He had been born in London, had grown up in the East End, had worked at the docks since his youth. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no known association with criminal elements. But he had worked previously as an attendant at the Bethnal Green Workhouse Infirmary, a position he'd held for 3 years before being dismissed in 1865. The reason for his dismissal was documented in the workhouse records. He had been found pilfering small amounts of food and medicine, selling them to supplement his meagre wages. The theft was petty, but it had cost him his position. The fact that Wainwright had worked at the infirmary was significant. He would have experience handling the sick and dying, would have become familiar with death, would understand how bodies could be moved and concealed. The infirmary dealt regularly with deceased paupers, preparing them for burial in mass graves. Wainwright would have participated in this work. He would have lost whatever squeamishness most people felt about handling corpses. The police theorised that this experience might have made it easier for him to kill children and dispose of their bodies without the emotional response that would prevent most people from committing such acts. Wainwright was brought in for questioning, here, was interviewed by Abberline and other senior detectives in a room at the Leman Street police station. The interview lasted several hours. Wainwright denied any involvement in the disappearances or murders. He acknowledged being in the vicinity of Shadwell Basin on the night Ellen Morrison's body was recovered, but maintained he had been walking home from work, had been nowhere near the wharf where Geddes had seen the figure, had thrown nothing into the water. He claimed he had heard Geddes' whistle, but had assumed it was related to warehouse business, and had continued on his way. When asked about his work history, Wainwright acknowledged his employment at the infirmary and his dismissal for theft. He expressed shame about the incident, said he had been desperate for money, had made a mistake he regretted. When asked why he had needed money so badly, he said he had been supporting his mother, who was ill at the time. She had since died. He now lived alone in a single room in a lodging house, worked when he could find employment, survived on minimal means like thousands of others in the East End. The police searched Wainwright's lodging. It was a single room on the 3rd floor of a building that housed 30 people. The room contained a narrow bed, a chair, a small table, a box with his few possessions. The police examined everything, looking for evidence that might connect him to the murdered children. They found nothing incriminating, no bloodstains, no children's clothing, no tools that might have been used to strangle or dismember victims. The room was as bare and unremarkable as any in the district. Geddes was asked to view Wainwright, to determine if he was the man seen on the wharf. Geddes examined him carefully. The height was right, the build was consistent, but Geddes could not say with certainty that this was the same man. The fog had obscured details, the distance had been considerable, The brief glimpse of the face had not been sufficient for positive identification. Wainwright might be the man, or he might be one of hundreds who matched the general description. Geddes would not swear to it. The police were faced with a dilemma. Wainwright was suspicious. His presence in the area, his background at the infirmary, his general matching of the physical description, all pointed toward him as a possible suspect. But there was no concrete evidence. No witness could positively identify him. No physical evidence connected him to any of the victims. No one had seen him with any of the missing children. The case against him was circumstantial at best, non-existent at worst. English law required more than suspicion for prosecution. The police needed evidence that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. They had none. After 3 days of questioning and investigation, Wainwright was released. He returned to his lodging, returned to his life, remained under police surveillance but free to move about the city. Abberline was frustrated but bound by the law. Suspicion was not proof. Possibility was not certainty. Unless more evidence emerged, unless Wainwright made a mistake, unless someone came forward with information that directly connected him to the crimes, there was nothing more to be done. The newspapers reported on Wainwright's questioning and release. Some praised the police for diligent investigation. Others criticised them for releasing someone who might be the killer. The public was divided. Some believed the police had found their man but lacked the evidence to convict him. Others believed Wainwright was innocent, another victim of the police desperation to solve a case that had become a humiliation. The debate continued in letters to editors, in conversations in public houses, in the constant churn of opinion that characterised the city. Wainwright himself became a marked man. He could not find work. Warehouse foremen who had employed him before now refused to hire him. His neighbours in the lodging house avoided him, fearing contamination by association. He was followed wherever he went, by police who maintained surveillance, by citizens who had appointed themselves vigilantes, by reporters hoping for a story. His life became unlivable. Within 2 weeks of his release he disappeared. He left his lodging without paying the rent owed, took whatever possessions he could carry, and vanished into the sprawl of London. The police searched for him, but could not locate him. He was gone, swallowed by the city that had spawned him. Chapter 9. The Last Fall of Fog. March arrived with signs of spring. The days grew longer. The cold loosened its grip. The Thames flowed less sluggishly. Its waters swelled by rain that fell with increasing frequency. And the fog, that thick murk that had characterised the winter months, began to appear less often. The meteorological patterns that produced the dense fogs depended on specific combinations of temperature and humidity, conditions that became rarer as the season shifted. The people of Whitechapel noticed the change. The air became clearer. The gaslights could be seen from farther away. The streets seemed less threatening, less likely to conceal horrors. No children had disappeared since February 20th, since Ellen Morrison had been taken, and her body later recovered from Shadwell Basin. 3 weeks passed with no new vanishings. Then 4 weeks. The police maintained their heightened presence. Constables still patrolling in greater numbers than normal. But the sense of immediate crisis began to fade. Families allowed their children slightly more freedom. The streets began to fill again with the sounds of young people, laughter and shouting, and the clatter of running feet. Hope, fragile and tentative, began to emerge. Perhaps it was over. Perhaps whatever had stalked the district had moved on, or been frightened away by the police attention, or simply run its course, but Abberline remained vigilant. He had studied the pattern too thoroughly to believe it had ended simply because time had passed. The disappearances had occurred during fog, during the darkest nights, during the months when conditions favoured concealment. Spring was arriving, but winter had not entirely departed. The possibility of fog remained. The possibility of another attack remained. He reviewed his notes constantly, searching for something he might have missed, some connection that would explain who was responsible and how they might be caught. On the night of March 14th, fog returned. It came suddenly, rolling off the river in the late afternoon, thickening as the evening approached. By dusk, visibility had dropped to a few yards. By full darkness, the fog was as dense as any that had occurred during the autumn and winter months. The police were ready. Abberline had planned for this possibility, had prepared an operation to be implemented if heavy fog occurred. He deployed every available constable to the streets, positioning them in a grid pattern that covered the entire area where disappearances had occurred. Plainclothes detectives were stationed at key locations, street corners, alleyways, the entrances to courts. The paid watchers took their positions. Every street, every passage, every route between the residential areas and the river was covered by at least one observer. The police also implemented a new tactic. They placed several children on the streets, volunteers from families that had agreed to allow their sons and daughters to act as bait. The children were carefully selected, brave, intelligent, old enough to understand the danger, but young enough to pass as ordinary street urchins. Each was equipped with a whistle and instructed to blow it if anyone approached them suspiciously. Each was shadowed by plainclothes officers who remained close enough to intervene instantly if danger threatened. The theory was that the killer, accustomed to taking children with impunity, might attempt to seize one of the decoys, at which point the watching police could apprehend him. The operation began at dusk. The decoy children took their positions on streets throughout the district. Some pretended to run errands carrying buckets or baskets. Others simply stood on corners or walked slowly as if heading home. The fog swallowed them within yards, making visual surveillance nearly impossible. The plainclothes officers crept closer than planned, unwilling to lose sight of their charges in the murk. The regular constables stood at their posts, whistles ready, eyes straining to see through the grey. The hours passed slowly. 8 o'clock came, 9, 10. The fog remained thick and cold. The streets were quieter than normal. Most families had heard about the increased police presence and kept their children indoors. But the decoys remained in position, playing their parts, waiting for something to happen. The tension among the police was palpable. That they knew the killer had struck on nights exactly like this. They believed or hoped that he would strike again, that he could not resist the opportunity, that this time they would be ready. At 10:30, a whistle sounded. It came from somewhere near Flower and Dean Street, shrill and urgent. Constables ran towards the sound, their boots pounding on cobblestones, their own whistles joining the first. The fog confused sound, made it difficult to determine exact locations. Some officers ran in the wrong direction initially, correcting their course when they heard voices calling out. Abberline himself was on the streets that night. He heard the whistle and ran toward it, his heart racing with the certainty that the moment had finally arrived. He found a cluster of constables surrounding a young girl, one of the decoys. She was shaking but unharmed. Between gasps, she explained what had happened. She had been walking along Flower and Dean Street, moving slowly as instructed, when she heard footsteps behind her. She had not turned around, had kept walking, aware that she was being followed. The footsteps had grown closer. Then a hand had touched her shoulder. She had spun around, reaching for her whistle, and found herself facing a man. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, his face partially obscured by the fog and the low brim of his hat. For a moment they had stared at each other. Then the man had spoken. He had asked if she was lost, if she needed help finding her way home. The girl had blown her whistle immediately. The man had recoiled at the sound, had turned and run into the fog. The plainclothes officers who had been shadowing her had given chase, but the fog had swallowed the fleeing figure within seconds. They had run in the direction he had gone, but had found nothing. He had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. By the time Abberline and the other constables arrived, there was no trail to follow, no indication of which way the man had gone. Abberline questioned the girl carefully. She was composed despite her fright, gave a clear account of what had happened. She described the man as well as she could. Tall, perhaps 6 feet, wearing a long dark coat that reached nearly to the ground. She had not seen his face clearly. The fog and the hat had obscured his features, but she had seen his eyes, or thought she had. They had been dark, she said, and cold, without expression or emotion. When he had asked if she was lost, his voice had been soft, almost gentle, but there had been something wrong about it, something that had frightened her more than the actual words. The description matched what Geddes had reported seeing at Shadwell Basin. The height, the coat, the emotionless demeanour. This was the same man, or someone fitting the same general profile. He had attempted to approach a child, had been frightened off by the whistle and the rapid response of the police. He was out there in the fog, somewhere in the maze of streets and alleys, moving through. The darkness with the skill that had kept him uncaught for months. Abberline made a decision. He ordered the operation to continue through the night. The decoy children were withdrawn. The risk had proven too great, the ability to protect them in the fog too uncertain. But the police presence remained. Every available officer was deployed. They would maintain the cordon, would watch every street and passage, would hope that the killer, having been interrupted in one attempt, might try again elsewhere, might make a mistake that would lead to his capture. The night continued. 11 o'clock, midnight, 1 in the morning. The fog showed no sign of lifting. The constables remained at their posts, cold and exhausted, but determined. Abberline walked the streets, moving from one position to another, encouraging the men, maintaining the discipline necessary for the operation to succeed. At 1:30, another whistle sounded, this time from near the river, in the area of the wharves and warehouses. Again the constables ran toward the sound. Again Abberline followed. They found 2 constables holding a man between them. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, struggling against their grip. He cursed them, demanded to be released, claimed he had done nothing wrong. One of the constables explained they had been watching a warehouse entrance when the man had emerged from an alley and begun walking toward the river. His behaviour had been suspicious. He moved quickly, looked behind him frequently, seemed to be avoiding the gaslights. They had challenged him and he had attempted to run. They had pursued and caught him after a brief chase. The man was brought to a gaslight where he could be examined. He was approximately 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair visible beneath his hat. His coat was old but of good quality, the kind a labourer might have purchased years ago, and kept in repair through careful maintenance. His hands were rough, calloused from physical work. His face was unremarkable, ordinary features, no distinguishing marks, the kind of face that could belong to any of 1,000 working men in the district. He gave his name as William Berry, claimed he was 38 years old, worked as a fish porter at Billingsgate Market, lived in a lodging house in Shadwell. Berry was taken to the Leman Street police station for questioning. Abberline conducted the interview personally. Berry maintained his innocence. He had been walking home from a public house where he had spent the evening drinking. He had taken a route through the alleys because it was shorter than the main streets. He had not been near any warehouses, had not attempted to hide from the police, had only run because he was frightened when the constables shouted at him. His story was plausible. Many men walked circuitous routes through the East End, taking shortcuts that only locals knew, avoiding well-lit streets to evade police attention for reasons having nothing to do with serious crime. The police searched Berry's lodging with his reluctant permission. They found nothing suspicious. His room was similar to Wainwright's, sparse, containing only the basic necessities of life. No evidence of murdered children, no bloodstains, no possessions that seemed out of place. His landlord confirmed that Berry had lived there for 2 years, paid his rent regularly, caused no trouble. His employer at Billingsgate confirmed his employment, said he was a steady worker, reliable if not particularly ambitious. Geddes was brought in to view Berry. He examined him carefully, looking for anything that matched his memory of the man on the wharf. The height was right, the build was consistent, but again, as with Wainwright, Geddes could not make a positive identification. Berry might be the man, or he might not. The fog and darkness had prevented clear observation. Geddes would not swear it in court. The girl who had been approached on Flower and Dean Street was also asked to view Berry. She looked at him through a one-way window, safe from direct confrontation. She studied him for several minutes. Finally, she shook her head. She did not think he was the same man. The height seemed right, but something about the way he moved, the way he held himself, was different. She could not say for certain, but her instinct said no. Barry was held for 48 hours, the legal maximum without charging him with a specific crime. The police investigated his background, verified his story, searched for any connection to the missing children. They found nothing. No one had seen him with any of the victims. No evidence placed him at the scenes of disappearances. His alibis for some of the key nights were verified by witnesses at the public house he frequented. At the end of 48 hours, lacking evidence to charge him, the police released him. The fog lifted on the morning of March 16th. The sun appeared for the first time in days, pale and wan but present. The streets dried. The air cleared. The operation had failed. 2 suspects had been identified and questioned. Neither could be charged. The killer, if either of them had been the killer, remained free. No more children had been taken that night, but whether that was because of the police presence or for some other reason could not be determined. Chapter 10. The Silence That Remains. The fog did not return. March passed into April into May, and the thick murk that had characterised the autumn and winter months did not reappear. The meteorological conditions that produced such fog were specific to the colder seasons, to the times when temperature and humidity combined in particular ways. Spring brought rain instead, cleansing rain that washed the streets and filled the Thames, rain that fell from clouds that could be seen rather than fog that seemed to emerge from nowhere. The gaslights burned brighter, the streets felt safer, and no more children disappeared. By the end of May, it was clear that the wave of abductions and murders had ended. 53 children had been reported missing during the period from early October to late February. 22 bodies or substantial remains had been recovered from the Thames. The other 31 were never found. They might have been disposed of elsewhere, in ways that left no trace. They might have been buried in unmarked locations, burned, dismembered beyond recognition. They might have been taken for purposes other than murder, sold into servitude or prostitution, transported to other cities or countries. The truth of their fates would never be known. The investigation continued in a formal sense through the summer, but the intensity declined. The police could not maintain the heightened presence indefinitely. Resources were needed elsewhere. Other crimes demanded attention. The constables returned to their normal duties. The plainclothes detectives moved on to other cases. Abberline compiled his reports, documenting everything that had been learned, preserving the details for future reference. He remained convinced that either Wainwright or Berry or someone very similar to them had been responsible. But without evidence, without witnesses who could make positive identifications, without physical proof connecting any individual to the crimes, there was nothing more to be done. The case was not officially closed. It remained open in the files of Scotland Yard, one of the many unsolved investigations that accumulated over the years, but it faded from public attention as new events captured the newspaper's interest. The murder of children in the East End, while horrific, was not sufficient to hold the focus of a city that moved rapidly from one sensation to another. By autumn of 1867, the newspapers rarely mentioned the case. By 1868, it was largely forgotten, except by those who had lost children to the fog. The families left behind struggled to continue. Some never recovered. Mothers who had lost children descended into melancholy, unable to function, unable to see purpose in continuing to live. Some died within years, whether from grief or from the diseases that ravaged the poor or from simple despair. Fathers worked and drank and tried not to remember. Siblings grew up haunted by the absence of brothers and sisters, carrying the weight of survival guilt. Why had they been spared when others were taken? The question had no answer. A few families left the East End entirely, fleeing the streets where their children had vanished, seeking new beginnings in other parts of London or in other cities altogether. They found that geography provided no escape from memory. The grief travelled with them, settled into their new homes, manifested in sleepless nights and sudden tears and the constant awareness that part of their family was missing. Some eventually returned to Whitechapel, drawn back by a familiarity, by the community of others who had suffered similar losses, by the simple fact that poverty left few options for where one could live. The district itself changed slowly. The construction of the new sewer system continued, transforming the infrastructure of the East End. The great tunnels designed by Joseph Bazalgette were completed over the following years, carrying waste away from the Thames, improving sanitation in ways that would eventually reduce disease and death. New buildings were constructed. Old rookeries were torn down. The streets that had seen the disappearances remained, but the people who walked them changed. Generations turned over. Those who remembered 1867 grew fewer with each passing year. Thomas Wainwright, the first major suspect, was never found. The police searched for him intermittently for several years, following rumours of sightings, investigating reports that he had been seen in other cities. None proved reliable. He had simply vanished into the mass of humanity that filled England's industrial cities. He might have changed his name, assumed a new identity, created a new life elsewhere. He might have died, succumbing to disease or accident or violence in some anonymous place where his body was buried or burned without record. He might have been the killer, or he might have been innocent, another victim in circumstance and suspicion. The question would never be answered. William Berry, the second suspect, remained in London for a few months after his release, then moved to Dundee in Scotland in 1869. He married there, worked as a peddler, lived a life that attracted no attention until 1889, when he was arrested for the murder of his wife. He had strangled her and mutilated her body in ways that some investigators thought similar to the methods used by Jack the Ripper, whose murders had occurred in Whitechapel the previous year. Berry was tried, convicted, and hanged for his wife's murder in April of 1889. Some speculated that he might have been responsible for the child murders of 1867, pointing to the strangulation method and the East End connection. But no evidence existed to support the theory. Berry denied any involvement until his death. The connection remained speculation, unprovable, one of the many theories that accumulated around unsolved crimes. The case of the missing children became part of the dark folklore of the East End. Stories were told in the lodging houses and public houses, passed from one generation to the next, evolving with each retelling. The fogwalker became a legend, a figure that parents invoke to frighten children into obedience. Stay close to home, do not wander in fog. The fogwalker takes children who disobey. The stories were meant to protect, to instill caution, but they also perpetuated fear, creating an atmosphere where the streets seemed perpetually dangerous, where fog itself became associated with menace. When Jack the Ripper murdered 5 women in Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888, some remembered the child murders of 20 years before. They noted the proximity, the unsolved nature of both sets of crimes, the particular horror that seemed to haunt these specific streets. They spoke of the Ripper's grandfather, suggesting a lineage of evil that stretched back through decades. The connection was more atmospheric than factual, based on location rather than evidence, but it persisted. Whitechapel became known as a place where monsters dwelt, where the normal rules of civilized society did not apply, where darkness had a particular density. The children who survived, who had lived through the autumn and winter of 1867, carried their own scars. They had seen their friends vanish. They had experienced fear that no child should know. They had learned that the world was not safe, that adults could not always protect them, that death could come suddenly and without warning. Some grew into cautious adults, overly protective of their own children, unable to let them out of sight. Others became hardened, accepting danger as a normal part of existence, teaching their children the same wariness they had learned. The trauma passed through generations in subtle ways, shaping how families approach the world. The Thames continued to flow indifferent to human suffering. Its tides rose and fell with the moon. Its waters carried ships and sewage and the debris of the city. Occasionally over the years that followed, the river yielded more remains. Small bones found by mudlarks, fragments discovered during construction projects along the banks. Some might have belonged to the missing children of 1867. Others were surely from different tragedies, different times. The river had swallowed countless dead over the centuries. It would swallow countless more. Its bed was a mass grave whose full inventory would never be known. The gaslights that had burned so inadequately during the foggy nights of the investigation were eventually replaced by electric lights. The progress that had seemed so distant in 1867 gradually transformed London. The streets grew brighter. The infrastructure improved. The worst of the poverty was slowly ameliorated through reforms and economic change. The East End of the 20th century would still be poor, still be difficult, but it would not be the same landscape of desperation that had existed in the 1860s. And yet the case remained unsolved. No deathbed confession emerged. No evidence surfaced years later to reveal the truth. The 53 children remained missing, their fates unknown except for the fragments recovered from the river. The investigation files gathered dust in the archives of Scotland Yard, consulted occasionally by historians or researchers interested in Victorian crime, but offering no resolution, no closure, no justice for those who had been taken. In the end, the silence was perhaps the worst aspect. The fog had come and taken children and then departed, leaving nothing behind but grief and questions. No explanation, no punishment for the perpetrator, no understanding of why these particular children had been chosen, why this particular period had seen such horror. The randomness of it was almost unbearable. If there had been a reason, a pattern that made sense however twisted, it might have been easier to accept, but there was only silence, and the memory of fog rolling off the river, and the knowledge that somewhere in those autumn nights, something evil had walked through the streets and left nothing but absence in its wake. The last victim, Ellen Morrison, was buried in a churchyard in Shadwell. Her grave was marked with a simple wooden cross that bore her name and the date of her death. The cross rotted away within a decade. The exact location of her grave was forgotten, but the memory of what had happened, the knowledge that children had been taken and murdered and disposed of like refuse persisted. It became part of the city's shadow history. The stories that were not told in official accounts, but lived on in whispered conversations, in warnings passed from parent to child, in the understanding that even in the heart of the greatest city on earth, darkness could descend and claim the innocent. The fog still comes to London. It rolls off the Thames on cold nights when conditions align in the right ways. It swallows the lights and muffled sound and turns familiar streets into alien landscapes. And when it comes, some remember. They remember the autumn of 1867. They remember the children who vanished. They remember that evil does not always announce itself, does not always leave evidence, does not always face justice. Sometimes it simply operates in silence, takes what it wants, and disappears back into the darkness from which it emerged, leaving behind only grief and questions that will never be answered. The candles burned low in the tenements of Whitechapel. The Thames flowed on through the city, carrying secrets to the sea. And history, having recorded what could be recorded, turned its pages to other tragedies, other times, leaving the missing children of 1867 to rest uneasily in the silence that remains. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through one of Victorian London's darkest mysteries. The Fogwalker case reminds us that not all of history's questions have answers, and not all its victims receive justice. If you enjoyed this exploration into the shadows of the past, please consider subscribing to the Bedside Historian and leave a comment telling me where you listened from tonight. Until we meet again in another forgotten corner of history, sleep well, and remember, the past may be gone, but it is never truly silent.